So there's an anecdote I sometimes tell for a laugh when I'm just speaking somewhere randomly, but it took place here, so I'll tell it again here. Right around the turn of the millennium, I turned 40. I was born in 1960, and I was lecturing in this building, and a freshman walked in the room and looked at me and said, "Jaron Lanier, you're still alive?" I was like, "Oh God." Computer science is a little rough on you, because it just moves so fast. And so anyway, yep, still going here, 53. Um, so I wrote a book last year very rapidly. Most people take off time to write a book. I somehow did it working overnights and on weekends while I was running other research projects, but it somehow got done. It's called Who Owns the Future, and it's about the relationship between technology and employment, technology and human roles, and particularly computational technology. Uh, so I'm going to share with you a summary view of it. The full picture is a little bit too complex to get into one talk, but I think I can summarize it. Uh, so let me start by recalling the excitement that I'm sure some of the people in this room will recall very vividly, but if you're younger, you won't have been born yet. Um, but the excitement that uh, arose around anticipation of networking before it actually worked, before it existed. So going back, I was a teenager in the 70s, and that's when I really started interacting with people about it. And this notion that someday there would be a way that information could just move around between people quickly and cheaply was just an astonishing idea. It was something so novel, so remarkable, and so profound that, of course, we still just marvel at it all the time. And a lot of our culture seems to be sort of self congratulatory at this point about the fact that the thing actually works. Um, but a part of that for me was a sort of imagining the good that would come of it. And that good would take place on various levels. For instance, my friends and I at the time, my comrades in this quest, believed that this would create tremendous economic opportunity, that all kinds of people would find ways to improve themselves, improve their lives when they had more open access to information. We also thought that it would serve as a kind of an inoculation against extreme power concentration. If you look at the history of how people treat each other badly, the recurring pattern is that somebody gets powerful and treats masses of people terribly, and the first thing they try to do is control communication. They try to control whatever the channels of communication are in the era in which they're being a creep, whether that's a TV station or the printing press or whatever. And so the notion was, well, if you have an open information system, it ought to make that pattern become more diffuse. So we're quite certain we're doing good things for the world. I was part of the generation that invented some of the rhetoric that's really become um, standard at this point. Last night I got in from New York City. I spoke at the United Nations General Assembly about this stuff this week, and it's remarkable to me to hear heads of state from around the world, the new cliches that they just parrot about technology and the future and the internet and openness are the stuff we made up in cafes in Palo Alto 30 years ago. A bunch of ne'er-do-well, hippie, freaky, geeky kids, and now this stuff is just the standard rhetoric. Um, and I I found myself in a bit of a personal crisis around the turn of the century, the same time that this student was surprised I still existed, um, because I felt that much of what I anticipated was not playing out as anticipated. I'll give you a couple of examples. One of them is that I'd been very much part of the early movement to encourage file copying and open sharing of information, and being suspicious of copyright law. And I'm also a musician, a professional musician, and I was certain that if we allowed music to flow freely and through file copying, that what that would result in is more opportunity. that clinging to this old business model was silly and short-sighted. So I helped make up a lot of the rhetoric that still is extremely commonplace and is held dearly by many people. But what I started to see around the turn of the century is that actually musicians were doing worse and worse. Now, of course, there's still some who do very well at the very tippy top of a power law curve. But what I was seeing is that what had been a middle hump, what had been approximately a standard distribution of outcomes, was turning into a hollowed out distribution with, or what we call a long tail. A lot of wannabes and only a few people who succeeded. And this hit me pretty hard in a special way, which is that uh, there were quite a large number, I'd say a whole generation of musicians who had been enormously successful and revered, and well, not enormously successful, but for they weren't like superstars, they weren't Michael Jacksons, but they were people who had um, gotten into the upper middle class at the very least, and were famous and were cherished, but in later in life, they hadn't been able to hold on to health insurance in the U.S. They'd lost their homes, and it was getting to the point where every week I was being asked to get involved in some emergency fundraiser at a jazz club or something, and I started to realize this isn't just a few exceptions. This is the pattern. And so what I started to do was try to gather real data on what was actually happening to the people that I thought we were helping. And I found something that was really kind of extraordinary to me. One thing is that the number of people who were making a good living in the era of copyright was actually larger than I had realized. In the United States, there were almost a third of a million musicians making over $100,000 a year, which it's not as good as it's not like selling Instagram to Facebook or something, but it's a very nice living. You can live well on that, certainly. Um, we might forget that in Silicon Valley, but that's considered success in most of the world, and uh, and that number had been driven down to by 2/3 within just about 5 years. There's a total collapse, and it seems to be headed to much less than that. It's continuing to drop, and um, meanwhile, there's this mythology that there are all these musicians who are coming up and um, doing great by creating unconventional careers using network technology, where they promote themselves, they get fans to show up, and there's people just assume there must be a replacement force that's coming in. So what I thought is, well, if the new wave is not being captured by the old measurements, which wouldn't be surprising, let's try to measure the new wave and see what's really going on. And so I started to try to count individual musicians who were being successful. And I did everything I could think of to do it. I went to every kind of business that might cater to them. And I know musicians. I mean, I tried, and I went on the popular sites that support this point of view, like the Boing Boings and whatnot. And I called out, if you have any stories of somebody doing this, send them to me. I tried to find them. And when I wrote my previous book, which was published a few years ago, the number I came up with was about 5 individuals. I mean, it's basically, they exist, they're real. And I think today, if you're willing to really relax your standards, we might be getting up into the low hundreds on a global basis. And in the US, maybe 50-ish. So, it's ramping up, but we're not seeing thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. We're seeing a very small phenomenon. And they're tenuous. What's interesting is the ones that I found a few years ago, of those, only one is still maintaining a career today. And so the thing is that this sense that there's this counter force of people who are creating a living in a new way is actually a fiction. It's a very popular fiction. It's kind of like the Satanists who steal babies or something. Like, it's this thing a lot of people believe is out there, but they are not actually out there. Um, there are people who pretend to be them, and it took a little bit of work to try to figure out what was real and what wasn't. But there are people who pay to create the illusion that they're making a living this way because it's fashionable. And then, in order to figure out who's authentic and who's not, sometimes you can just ask them, and sometimes it takes a bit more work. But in terms of clear-cut examples, they're very, very, very rare. Um, what is not rare at all is somebody who's extremely well established in the traditional system doing something like a giveaway on the internet for publicity. So if you're Radiohead or something like that, that works great. And there's a lot of examples of that. I don't think that should count. That's a publicity thing, and they still count on they still count on the traditional system for their money. Anyway, so just in terms of musicians, I found myself disappointed in the economic results. So then I wanted to look at, well, you know what, if it's just musicians and journalists and photographers, if it's certain specific classes, which are the people who are sort of dealing with information anyway, if it's the communicators, if it's those people, that's okay, because we can create institutions to support them. We can create new institutions to support investigative journalists. We can compensate. Society can figure that out. That's an acceptable failure because if it's part of a greater success. So that's where I was at for a while. But then I started to, I've been quite involved in technologies that could throw masses of people out of work myself, you know. And I realized, I think what struck me one day is I was at one meeting in Silicon Valley where we were talking about how to train people to, how can we use internet technologies and mobile technologies to train people in underdeveloped parts of the world so they can have jobs. And the kinds of jobs we were going to train them in were service, manufacture, some agricultural, different kinds of things like this. But then that same day I went to another meeting where we were creating robots that would do all the same stuff. And if we chart the course, the expected course of the improvement of those robots, it's really pretty clear that any solution we could come up with for using our network technologies to train people would be very temporary, because we'd probably have a decade at most, and probably a lot less, before we made our training obsolete. And so any solution would have to have a very different form. So I became very interested in this problem. And I've talked to all kinds of people with all kinds of points of view on it, all kinds of different economists. And I've developed my own opinion about where the solution space could be. Some people find it quite radical. My last book, I think, is distinguished by having perhaps the most positive and just ebullient, ecstatic reviews I've seen in major publications about any book. I mean, the New York Times book is reviewing it as if it's the new Bible or something. And then I've also gotten perhaps the worst reviews I've ever seen. So the Washington Post review was treating it as like the worst book ever. So I have this incredibly wide range of responses, which I like a lot better than uniformly positive ones. So let me present to you the position I've come to, which is still in flux and not sacred by any means.
A question about the history you presented.
Uh-huh.
You said there was 300,000 musicians making a living doing music in the 1980s, roughly?
No, at the turn of the century.
Turn of the century.
2000.
Turn of the century, okay. Well, what were most of them doing? Were they
This was performing musicians who were whose income was substantially royalty driven. So these were people. Yeah. So this is not. This was, and the reason you can tell is because in tax records it falls in different categories, so you can actually find those people.
Sousa said that the live performing people would get wiped out by records, which they sort of did, and then. So
right. Well,
yeah.
Yeah. Before you give me the argument about how it's always that people have always been displaced in creative destruction, I want to go through that in great detail. And to do that, since you brought up John Philip Sousa, I would like to use that as a segue to speak about the 19th century, if I may. I'd like to present an overly simplified view of the history of technology and employment and economics in the form of a melodrama in 3 acts. And I'm obviously tremendously oversimplifying, and there'll be all kinds of exceptions. But I just want to try to give a very quick picture. So I want to start with the 19th century, that's Act 1, and then we'll do the second act is the 20th century, and the third act is our century, the 21st century. The 19th century was an extraordinarily future-oriented period. If you go into the literature of the 19th century, you find a tremendous emphasis on what the future will be like, what the definition of a person will be, what human roles will be like, and also what technology will be like. I'm going to mention just a few of the key moments in this 19th century obsession with technology. I think a good starting point is the Luddite riots. Um, and so I'm sure people here would be familiar with that, but in case you're not, these were riots in London conducted by textile workers who were concerned that improving textile machinery would throw them out of work. They were ugly riots and they ended in executions. Um, they weren't anti-technology per se, but they expressed this intense fear that when somebody moves to the city from the countryside and they're dependent on an institution for their living instead of just the land, then if that institution is going to shift around unpredictably, they feel terribly insecure and will become violent to protect their position. And that was kind of a new thing. Um, but let me mention a couple of other interesting 19th century things. Starting in the 1840s, a writer named Karl Marx, largely inspired by the Luddite riots and similar ones, started writing about technology. And if you read the early Marx, before he was trying to turn into Hegel, he was a technology writer who would have ended up as a kick-ass editor-in-chief of Wired or something. And I discovered this one day when I was listening to KPFA, the lefty station from Berkeley, while driving, and I heard what I thought was a description of a new Silicon Valley startup, where they were saying, we're gonna create such efficiencies that there will no longer be market barriers, and we're gonna, and I was kind of like, oh my God, I can't listen to more of this stuff. And I was trying to say, this has been an anniversary reading of Marxism. And they're like, what? So I went back and read Marx. And Marx really had to start as a technology writer. And his concern was very explicitly what happens to people. He's a Moore's Law frame person from well before computation or Moore's Law. He's saying we're not living in a time of constancy. We're living in a time where technology is ramping up. And the better technology gets, the more people's roles will have to change. And at some point, when the machines can do a lot of stuff, what do all the people do? And he said, are there going to be just a tiny minority that benefit from the machines, or will everybody benefit from the machines? And now Marx is a sort of I don't know how to put this anymore. There's no nice way to say this. His ideas for what to do were crap. I mean, he really suggested ideas that led to some of the most brutal regimes in modernity. So I'm absolutely not supportive of his ideas for what to do about it. And he was also a fantasist. He had this idea that when the machines got good, we'd all live in classically manicured lawns and practice archery and read the classics. In other words, everyone was supposed to live in his heaven, which is exactly the problem with a socialist utopia, that you have somebody deciding what's good for everybody. So problematic in terms of his ideas for solutions. But his articulation about the problem was extraordinarily prescient and really, I think, astonishing for its time. Another thing that was born in the 19th century that we still live with is science fiction. Science fiction started off as a way to contemplate what people would do when the robots got good. If you look at science fiction is always about what people will be like, or will people become obsolete or not? That's the question science fiction asks. And we might be made obsolete by a superior alien or by our own machines. Those are the two options. It's usually the machines that, and if just what I said covers all the scripts recently. It covers, let's go through them: Battlestar Galactica, Terminator, Matrix, blah, blah, blah. It's always the same thing over and over again. A really good 19th century example is The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, where humanity bifurcates into two species, and the rich ones are the descendants of people who had successful IPOs here, and then the poor ones are farmed and eaten by them, and they're both miserable ultimately. And it's an interesting novel. Uh, the, how, there aren't that many folk songs from the 19th century that we still remember today, but the Ballad of John Henry is one, and it's about a guy who's racing with a robot that lays down railroad tracks, and he beats the robot, but only by working so hard that he dies of exhaustion, tragically, at the end of the song. So that's the 19th century. So a really interesting question is, why didn't the calamity appear? Why was there still employment in the 20th century? And here, I think the answer comes from a very interesting dual process. One process came from below and had a lefty quality, and another came from on top and had a kind of industrialist's point of view quality, and they came together and converged on a solution. So let's talk about the labor unions first. Now, whenever you talk about this problem of whether people might lose work because of technology, a very typical response is, "Oh, you just don't like creative destruction." And think about buggy whips. You would have defended the buggy whip industry. And the buggy whip industry was a big industry at one point. And I might mention that it was centered in Rochester, New York, which recovered from the loss of buggy whips by developing the photography companies Kodak and Polaroid that are now bankrupt. And Instagram was sold for $1 billion when it had 13 employees. Hopefully, some of them Stanford graduates who will give generously or something. I have no idea. But anyway, uh, the um, uh, but anyway, let's go back to the buggy whip era. I don't. How many of you have actually dealt with horses? How many of you have ridden horses or raised them? So horses are great, aren't they? They're just wonderful animals. But if you had a job where every day you were given some horse not of your choosing, and you had to deal with it, you had to brush it, you had to deal with not getting kicked by it, you had to deal with its poop every day, you'd be pretty unhappy, right? It's hard. That would not be an easy day's work. So this idea of the automobile, the automatic motion machine, where you just get in and you do this and it moves. I mean, my God, we pay for that experience. We pay to have nice sports cars. We love it. So there, if you go back to the literature during the transition years from horses to automobiles and trucks, one of the things that was often said is, well, if somebody's going to be driving one of these automatic horseless machines, why the hell should they be paid? That's fun. That's easy. They're not covered in poop, and they're not at risk of getting kicked, and they're living in luxury. Why should they get paid? It's a really interesting question. And and yet we have Teamsters and cabbies and all these people. So how did that happen? So as I mentioned, there are two processes that came together. The labor union fought really hard to create jobs, even if those jobs were not so miserable that even if they were less dangerous or miserable than previous jobs from older tech generations. Now, this is an interesting challenge because if the job's really easy and you can just sit there and earn money, why wouldn't everybody want to do it, and why wouldn't there be a spiral to the bottom in terms of wages, just like we see on Mechanical Turk or something today, right? Why wouldn't that happen? And so in order to create wages, despite the fact that the work wasn't miserable or dangerous, they instituted really awkward, bureaucratic, inefficient, corruptible exception cases. And so these were called licenses or union membership or certificates or whatever. There was this whole weird structure of ad hoc little latches that you could achieve to keep other people out of the job. And I call them levees in the book, like the little dams that keep water in an irrigation system. Now, this is a really imperfect system. I should mention that even though it has a much older origin, academic tenure was one of these in the 20th century. So don't feel yourselves not to be a part of this. You very much are. So anyway, so that was the labor movement, and it with tremendous effort, created a sense of wages even for jobs that weren't miserable. Meanwhile, what's fascinating, I believe that in itself wouldn't have worked. Henry, by itself, I think it was an essential but not sufficient process. Henry Ford, the great entrepreneur of making buggy whips obsolete, um, was, by the way, a racist bastard, but let's get that out of the way. He was also a successful entrepreneur. He was perhaps even more than what Steve Jobs was to us recently. He was an extraordinary man of his time in terms of building industry. And one of the things he said is that there cannot be a market economy without customers, which seems quite obvious. And so he said, if we're building our product base, if we're building our industry, we have to build customers or we will have no industry. And so the idea was that the Model T and the other early cars had to be built in such a way that they could be afforded by the people who made them. And he had to set wage standards in the whole economy, starting with his own factory, such that people could afford the products they were building. So he had to. So in a very weird way that neither of them would ever admit, because they would certainly hate each other's guts, these two forces of necessity actually work towards the same goal, which is really it's an extraordinary marriage of convenience that nobody would ever admit to. So both of those things took place. And this, by the way, is something that always amazes me when I talk. There's a tremendous fascination with Ayn Rand style libertarianism in Silicon Valley, of course. And I'll say, well, how can you have a market economy without a customer class? It just won't work. You have to have some kind of a bell curve distribution. If you have only successful entrepreneurs and nobody to use their products, it falls apart. But we'll get back to that. All right. So now we've made it to the 20th century. Now we come to the turn of the century. We come to the 21st century. And in my view, right around the turn of the century, kind of on the mark, Silicon Valley made a decision to renounce the covenant that had made the 20th century work and decide, you know what, by the time computation's getting so cheap that all the stuff's just there in your pocket or something, at that point you don't get paid. I mean, for God's sakes, that's just too easy. So we're not going to pay people anymore. That's approximately what happened. Um, I Now, I should say it's not our fault. What had really happened is that in the previous couple decades, 2 or 3 decades, some other industries had discovered something about computation that we were actually slow to get. Because when it comes to capitalism, Silicon Valley was actually a little slow, I gotta say. Um, Early on, financiers realized, hey, if you have a big computer, you can just use it to outcompute everybody else and just pull money out of the market. I mean, for God's sake. So we'll get big computers. So from very early on, as soon as Moore's law allowed computers to be big enough for anything to happen, it did happen on Wall Street. So we had the first flash crash, not recently, but in '87, way early on Moore's law curve compared to now. How many of you know what long-term capital management was? So I'm not seeing too many hands of young people go up. Congratulations, sir. But I always say to young people, if you're Americans, and actually even if you're not Americans, you really should know about this because you will be paying for it your whole lives. So you might as well know what you're paying for. What? And your kids, yeah. So what it was is it was one of the early schemes where somebody used massive amounts of computation to try to find slight advantages using just statistics and inference and projection to optimize investments in a marketplace just to pull money out of it. And it was done with great fanfare. They had a bunch of Nobel laureates in economics as advisors so that it would look very proper, and they got a bunch of money in. Now, there's an interesting thing about computation in economics, which is all right. Now, let me just say a couple of extremely basic truths, okay? It's an extremely basic truth that statistical projection will be valid for a smoothly changing variable in reality for a time, right? If there's something smoothly varying and you're charting it, you'll be able to predict it a little bit. The problem is that lacking any underlying theory, you don't know for how long you'll be able to. Okay. Now, there's a very fashionable idea in some quarters, I hope not here, that because we have such big computers now, we don't really need science and theory anymore because we can just use statistics and projection. For instance, a guy who's a friend of mine and lives as my neighbor actually, who was the editor-in-chief of Wired for a long time, Chris Anderson, wrote a famous essay a few years ago, which was called something like The End of Science or The End of Theory. And the idea was that we just use big computation to correlate and extrapolate, and we don't really need this whole idea of theory and scientists and all this stuff. We just have computation now. But the problem with that is that reality is not some big, continuous, smoothly varying thing. Reality has structure, and if you can't talk about that structure, you have absolutely no way of knowing for how long your purely statistically derived projection will be good. It'll run into some kind of wall. And so what always happens with these schemes that are done, this sort of idea of a remote control money machine always hits a wall at some point, and then guess what happens? There's a gigantic public bailout because it's super highly leveraged because everybody believed in it totally. So there was one of these fantastic failures of long-term capital in the 90s, if I remember correctly, and we're still paying for that one. That was a huge one. But then I think that one in a way was forgivable because I think people went into it with it was like me when I was talking before about the wonders that people sort of were not experienced with it, and they just thought, wow, it's computation combined with statistics, combined with data. It's an automatic money machine. You just press this button and money should come out, right? It's automatic. So they just believed it. And so then it turned out not to be true. The thing is that afterwards, people continued to do it without learning the lesson. So there's another one a little later called Enron. You guys know about that one? All right, and so that you're still paying for that one too, and the pattern continues with the Great Recession of 5 years ago. Very similar pattern. It works for a time until it breaks. It's not too unlike, I mean, in a sense, it's like traditional market bubbles and failures, the old tulip craze. Uh, Markets have always had this capacity. It's just that if you bring big computation automation into it, you amplify it to a fantastic degree. So it's possible to argue that about how novel this phenomenon is. Another company that understood how big computation could sort of turn on a spigot of gradual sort of wealth that felt guaranteed was Walmart. Walmart did a computational model of its supply chain in order to optimize to drive prices down versus its competitors. Extraordinary thing. So in the backdrop of seeing all the success using big computation, Silicon Valley's own entrepreneurs had never really played a game like that. We'd never said, oh, we'll just analyze the world to our advantage and extract a profit from it. We'd never done that particular thing. Other people had done it using our tools. And then the guy who really, I think, first tried it that I ever heard of anyway was a sweet guy who I still adore and think is just lovely. And he was a student here, Sergey Brin, who sometimes claims to have had the thought to impress a date. You know how Stanford women are, you have to really come up with something. So at least that was true when I was around here. The idea was, we'll get computation's getting so cheap, we'll give away the services, we'll expect to gather the data that drive the services for free, and then we'll sell advertising. And it sounds really good at first. It sounds sort of like this great scheme that could just scale forever. What I have come to believe is that it's actually a huge mistake. Nothing against Google. By the way, just to say, I'm not anti-Google. I sold a company to Google. A ton of my friends are there. I still feel close to the place, so I'm not anti-Google in any sense. But I feel that, and also Microsoft does exactly the same thing with Bing. We all do it. It's not, so this is not in any sense an anti-Google rant. But the thing is, I think that this way of thinking about the world is self-limiting. I think that it's based on math that self-destructs at unpredictable moments. Just like the problem that happens when financiers use computation naively and believe they have this automatic money machine. So let me explain a little bit about why I think that. Wow, how do I even begin? Let me go back. I started a little earlier talking about musicians as a particular class and how I felt that employment for musicians was not enjoying the benefits that had been predicted. And the next question to ask is that an isolated or exceptional case, or does that portend something larger for the economy? If it's exceptional, then we can deal with it as an exception. If it's not exceptional, then we have a bigger problem. So I've come to believe the latter. And so there's several reasons for that, but the first one I think is pretty obvious, which is just that there are waves of technology coming up that will just throw traditional employment into turmoil and could create mass unemployment waves. So I'll just mention a few of them. I've participated in the creation of many of these. I'm sure many of you have too, because they all come from right around here. Um, One of them is self-driving vehicles, which would undo the jobs of all those cabbies and truck drivers I was talking about before. And the first one that worked really well was the Stanford team responding to the DARPA Grand Challenge. So that came from right here. 3D printing is another one. 3D printing is currently a hobbyist thing that makes little knickknacks, and it's not much of anything. However, in principle, anyone who understands it can see that it could be refined to the point where it could be spitting out future tablets or something. They might not be the very best ones, but they certainly could be functional. And we can, if we project ahead 10 years, 20 years, we start to imagine, I think realistically, 3D printing creating fully functioning mechanisms. The economics of 3D printing could have extraordinary efficiencies where you could have hyper-efficient recycling because you'd have records of how something was built. So you could unwind objects that had been printed. You'd have probably a new cartel economy around the antecedents for 3D printing and a few other dysfunctions. But overall, it should create a tremendous increase of efficiency. Another example, when people talk about the future of employment, they often say, well, the kinds of jobs that will survive are the ones that are sort of very human touch, like nursing or something like that. But the thing is, if you look at the progress in robotics for nursing, particularly in a few hotspots where this is happening in Japan is of great interest, you see incredible progress and rapid progress. You see, and it's kind of a sensible progress because the truth is that intensive nursing is unpleasant work. It's analogous to that horse problem I was mentioning before, for similar reasons, and and so that's not necessarily a bad thing at all. As anyone in this department knows very well, a lot of jobs that have traditionally required considerable intellectual effort are automatable. We know that mid-level legal researchers. Hey, by the way, guys, I just want to say I'd love if you have a question, please ask. But if you're whispering in the back, it kind of is distracting. Is that okay? I'm sorry. I always give my own students hell about it, so I feel like I should do it while I'm here too. So you can text to each other. You can sit there. Anyway, so so what we see is field after field where we had assumed that you'd need a real person there. We have a potential to substitute one form or another of an information system. Furthermore, even in cases where that's not true, we can bring in hyper efficiencies using information systems. And a great example of that is MOOCs, where I have no doubt that Stanford and its brand and its desirability would survive any scenario like this. I'm not so sure about Hayward State across the bay. I'm not so sure about, I mean, basically what we could end up with is very much like YouTube videos or something, a sort of a power law distribution with a few institutions that draw everybody and then a massive number of wannabes that go bankrupt and disappear. I view that as unacceptable, with all due respect to institutions like Stanford, which I value and obviously tremendously. But it depends what you think education is, and I can get in. This thing about the future of MOOCs and education is interesting, but I'll leave that as a separate discussion. At any rate, in all of these different areas of human endeavor, you can see that the very technologies that we love to work on the most could create massive unemployment. And yet, there's something fishy going on. And here's the way I see it. If you go back to early computer science, the early culture of computer science from before I was born in the 50s, the first generation of people interested in artificial intelligence had no idea what to expect. And you shouldn't, it's not proper to make fun of reasonable hypotheses from an earlier era that turned out to be wrong, because I'm positive some of ours and mine will turn out to be wrong too. But there was a kind of a sense of incorrectness from a later perspective, because in the first generation of AI, famously, there was the sense that if you could just come up with the right formula, the right compact representation, you could do things like translate between languages or interpret all these things that these days we think of as being problems that require big data and statistics, right? And so there's been a transformation of our assumptions about how to solve certain kinds of problems. But if you go back to the early days, there was this. My great mentor when I was a kid was Marvin Minsky, and he'd been part of this generation who really had thought initially that you could just come up with the perfect little parser to translate between languages or something. Turned out it wasn't an unreasonable hypothesis, but at any rate, because our field started with that idea, that sort of model, even though we kind of shifted to a different technique in order to actually solve problems, and properly so, something about the ghost of that original idea still hovers with us. And so, for instance, let me go back to this idea of giving stuff away in exchange for advertising. So companies like Google and Microsoft will be happy to, for free, translate a document between languages. So you upload in English, get back something in Chinese, and it's getting to be okay. It's still a bit shaky, but there's often some utility in it. And so the way this is talked about in public and the way we tend to present it is like there's this big electronic brain and it's translating your documents for free, and what a great benefit. As we all know, the way it actually works is there are gigantic corpora that are scraped constantly from the internet so that we keep up with changes in language. And we correlate the input document with these corpora and then calculate an output. And so the thing about that is that there are real translators who are sitting there behind a curtain, and we're pretending that they don't exist. We're pretending. So the thing about anytime you have a big data solution, the key thing to remember, the key insight here, is that there are no mystical aliens or angels or sort of weird supernatural beings that provide big data. It all, like, if there's big data in somewhere, somebody had to do work to put it there, unless it's invalid. Sometimes they do. That's true. I've seen that as well. So the thing is, there's always these real people, and so there's a funny little switcheroo going on here, where we're saying, oh, here's this giant electronic brain that we're offering for free to translate your document, but just don't pay attention to all those people who provided the example data that turned into the corpora that's absolutely essential to it functioning. All right. So once you notice that, then a pattern starts to emerge, and the pattern is that in all the cases, and the particulars are different in each case, and I recognize that, but in all the cases where we might see massive unemployment result from improvements in information technology, there's also some massive data collection that depends on people who are not acknowledged or paid. That those two things go together. They don't always go together to the same degree, and there are exceptions. So for instance, for self-driving vehicles, that's more data about the world and less creative input from individuals. And so, so they're acknowledging that there are differences in the different cases. There's still a general pattern. Even in the case of vehicles around the world, even in that case, there still has to be that pilot vehicle that's gathering data before the automated ones do, if there's been a big change, and so forth. There's still human labor at the core of data gathering. It's not the skyhook that just takes off on its own, even though we might like to pretend it is. So, to my mind, if we have a generality in the nature of the problem of employment, then this provides at least a seed of an approach to a generality and a solution that addresses it. And the solution would be to pay people who contribute to corpora. Now, before I want to go into a little bit of the history of that idea, because I did not invent that. But I just want to say that the test that I think should apply is that you should ask, does a given datum exist because a person exists? If that person did not exist, would that datum still exist? And that's a very broad thing. So that counts for measuring somebody in a street cam in a way that might lead to improved efficiency in the sidewalk design eventually. It counts for somebody's DNA or other biological data or medical history. It counts for their intentional creative output and for their unintentional output through behavior measurements of any kind. It's a very broad standard, and I believe that that's the one that would need to be applied here. And I'll get into why in a second. But at any rate, let me go into the history of the idea of paying people for data that they contribute over a network. Interestingly, it was born with the very first articulation of how you could use digital networks to collaborate or communicate. And that's something really wild. And this goes back to Ted Nelson in 1960 at Harvard when he was a student. So if we look at the history of attempting to visualize what networking would be like, it's very rich in the days before computers actually existed. If any of you haven't read The Machine Stops by E.M. Forster, read it. It's like 1907, 08 or something like that. And it's a short story that more or less describes everything. It has Facebook and Skype, and it has hackers and trolls, and it's really wild. And it was in that tradition I was talking about. It's part of the same stream of the early science fiction, very similar in a way to H.G. Wells. And I should mention, if any of you are interested in Mark Twain's science fiction is astonishing about the future of communications. And he has like Skype-like formulations that are wonderfully rendered. The famous piece that most people have heard of is Vannevar Bush's 40s piece, As We May Think, which imagined an elaborate microfiche that included metadata and traces and all. It was very impressive. But as far as actually thinking about doing something with bits and sort of connected Turing machines as a way for people to do something together, so far as I know, Ted Nelson was the first person to articulate how that would work. And he imagined sort of naturally and for exactly the right reason, that this would be monetized. So the idea is that if somebody puts some bits onto the network and then somebody else derives some value of them, incorporates them into something, feeds them into a calculation, whatever it is, there'd be a micropayment that would feed back to the person who's the source of the bits. Now, Ted Nelson is still with us. He's in his 70s, I think, and he's living on a houseboat in Sausalito. Um, Ted is an eccentric, beatnik guy who is often not his own best advocate and can be a little obscure and difficult on occasions, and very eccentric in his presentation. And that's me saying that. So it's intense, and so that's probably why his work isn't as well known. He also was had sort of a perfectionist vision where he would get this group of people to implement the thing, which he called Xanadu for the most part, and they would produce this perfect network architecture that the whole world would adopt. And needless to say, it fell apart, and nothing was ever good enough, and it's the whole thing. So it kind of never really shipped. One of the classic stories of how not to ship. That's why you might not have heard of him and why you might not be familiar with his work. Now, the interesting thing is that in the intervening decades between the early 60s and when the internet started to work and then when the web started to work, during that period in the 70s and early 80s, there was a kind of a rejection of monetizing information, and it happened in a culturally strange way. And that I was around for. I'm a direct witness to that phase. When Ted started this stuff, I was born, in 1960. So that I'm not a direct witness to. But this other phase I was. And I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but there are a couple of things about that era. One is that computers were still pretty slow, and so to share data, you have to rely on what we used to call the sneaker net. I'm sure some of you remember, which is you'd have to transfer data to a physical transport medium, which was different in different eras. I mean, it was punch cards at one point, and these days you think of a USB stick or something, but you had to actually physically transfer the information to something you could move to another machine. And so during that period, it became very commonplace to have OSs that could copy files from here to there to achieve that. However, in the original concept of digital networking, there would be no copying. And the reason why is so obvious, which is that it's already there. It's a network, right? But because of that sneakernet era, copying became kind of considered normal. Now, this idea of not copying, because it's still there. Now, I should say, the idea of not copying on a network doesn't preclude having local caches for efficiency or having backups for robustness. But in terms for logical copies, they shouldn't be needed on a well-wrought network, right? That should be axiomatic. Is that clear? Somehow it sounds weird today. It used to sound totally normal. In the 70s, when I was a teenager, and I would worshipfully visit Xerox PARC up the road, and during the era when Alan Kay was there and building these amazing prototypes of the machines that we think of as normal today, I remember seeing copying in the Xerox PARC prototypes. It's like, why are you copying files? You just invented Ethernet here. You actually can connect your computers. Why the hell don't you use the thing you made? Why are you doing this? And it would pull me over. And I remember people like Larry Tesler, like, wait, we're funded by a copying company. You can't say that copying is going to be obsolete. We will lose our funding. Don't say that. So that was another reason why copying happened. Finally, there was a sort of a weird period in the 70s that's kind of forgotten, which is when among young technical men especially, it became very popular to be able to be anonymous in your communications. The reasons for this were different. In the earliest days of network research, there were kind of two kinds of network nodes, research nodes. One would be military, because DARPA was funding it, and one would be academic. And so the academic ones were kind of people who were freaked out about the selective service system, were freaked out about the drug laws, and wanted to be able to be secretive. The military guys were pissed off that Jimmy Carter had lowered the speed limit and wanted to be able to speed with impunity, so they were avid users of this thing called CB radio, which became the prototype for a kind of idea about internet identity. So how many of you don't know what CB radio was? Yeah, so this was a thing that was more present in the culture and perhaps more vivid in conversation than Twitter is today. There were popular songs about it. It was this huge thing. And what it was is you'd get on this radio in your car and you'd make up a fake name and you'd warn other people where the police were so you could all speed without having to deal with the speed limit. Smokey was
It's still there.
it's there, but it's not as present. I mean, but so anyway, there were all this very weird combination of historical and social circumstances led to this idea that everything can be copied and lose provenance. So when you copy something over a network, you actually lose value because you lose the provenance, and you create inefficiencies because you're duplicating storage requirements. Um, so losing provenance is a huge deal. I mean, more or less, what Google did was try to regain provenance after the fact that shouldn't have been lost in the first place. And something similar can be said about Facebook, because in the original formulation, you'd know who was interested in your material because there'd be a direct link. And so this also has to do with the idea of whether a network has one-way links or two-way links. And I very vividly remember when Tim Berners-Lee proposed the web design, there'd been all kinds of people trying to do a networked hypermedia design, tons of them. There was a famous startup in Palo Alto, I think it was in Palo Alto, it was called General Magic, that was the original Apple Mac OS team trying to make something similar to what turned into the web. And there were a bunch of other ones. And everybody was like, you have to have two-way links, so you have provenance. And Tim was like, provenance it's like so much work. We could just get so much more rapid spread. And he's absolutely correct about that. It's a very friction-free way for things to spread. Yeah.
Backlinks were a primary feature of the Xanadu system. And in fact, probably was the reason why Xanadu was so slow to actually get
Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, to have backlinks, to have two-way links requires actual computer science and not just hacking.
Well, it had that. But
No, I mean, it's hard. It's hard. To maintain it is hard. No, doing backlinks means you have to manage your whole network like a Lisp system or something. It's not.
Actually, Ward Cunningham is trying to address this right now with federated wikis.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. But in my opinion, it has to be done more universally. I think I even have a UN resolution now that nobody will ever read again to Anyway, we ended up with this world of one-way links for the most that dominate. We ended up in a world with unconfirmed identities. We ended up and it's this different world, and it's this world where information is assumed to not be contextualized, where we assume we don't have provenance, and so. The problem I have with that is that if we go from where we are with all of these waves of new technology that I am still as enthusiastic about as ever. I'm a very strong believer in self-driving vehicles, for instance. My mom died in a car accident. I think people are terrible drivers. I want our cars not to hit each other anymore. All right, I mean, it's just like that. It's that simple. So that has to happen. That's not an option. That's a necessity. 3D printing is also a necessity. Our current manufacturing practice of going anywhere in the world where people work for less and then having this enormous movement of raw materials and products on these huge ships around just to do that, it's just moronic. We can't keep doing that. That's like a stupid way to run a world. So these things are necessary. They're good. However, obviously we have a problem with employment in that world. So some of my friends, I would say I have a lot of friends who tend to either a sort of a libertarian extreme or a lefty extreme who aren't bothered by this. The leftists say, this is great. If there's massive unemployment, it'll finally force the revolution. And I'm like, we had the revolution in the 20th century. They did it in Russia and China. It really sucks bad. Let's learn from that instead of, let's not have that one again. We did it. It sucks. No, like if you can't accept that an experiment has taken place and generated a result, you've really got a problem. Like, you've got to be able to see that. But then the libertarians also have a little bit of a strange this attitude that even if structurally you create a society that's based on a power a power law where only a few succeed well and everybody else isn't wannabes, it doesn't matter because, and there are a couple of ways that this is explained away. One way is to say our technology will get so good and cheap that even the people at the bottom will do well. They'll be the one, they'll be, in exchange for an ad to go to a cafe, there'll be a free robot that does your heart surgery or whatever. And so there's that sort of attitude, or this sort of like, well, the people who aren't really contributing don't deserve to be part of it anyway, and this sort of let them fail kind of a thing, which I just think is phony because we do rely on their data for what we do. It's just not true, Yeah.
How long do you think large quantities of new data will be necessary to provide basic goods and services that are good enough?
Right. So that's a point I go into in my book. So presumably for any given digital service, there's some threshold point where it becomes at least commercially viable because it has enough data, and then other data might refine it. But so, for instance, I think the corpora we have for machine translation between languages are probably need to grow. I don't think they're adequate yet, but at some point the thing will start to it's performing better and better. So we could say it's asymptotically approaching some sort of an acceptable level, and then at that point you might say, well, we have the data. So there are two answers to that question about the long-term value of adding to corpora. One answer is that presumably there'll be other digital services, and this actually is a crucial point where I think that there would probably be quite a distribution of ways that people provide value over different times, and over somebody's lifetime they might at different times be contributing to different corpora in different ways. So I'm displaying a kind of, if you like, a libertarian faith that there would be innovation, there would be more things, and we won't just come to this one set of circumstances and say, hey, technology's done, we've done it, we're happy, I don't see that happening. That's Marx's fantasy of the lawns, right? I don't see that. But the other thing I'm proposing in the book, and this gets into more detail, is that the price of information in a genuine open market where buyers and sellers have genuine mobility and where there's a genuine market dynamic should create an effect where the price for adding data to a corpora actually values that data more as the corpora approaches completion. And so I use this crazy metaphor in the book, but I'm just going to use it with you now. Let's consider the Stone Age, and there's like some cave guy who comes out of a cave and grunts. All right, and you might say, well, how much did that guy get paid for grunting? It's like, no, everybody's grunting. Who cares? That's not worth anything. You don't pay somebody to grunt. But these days, in specialized circumstances, a movie star might get $1 million per grunt, depending on the script, right? So in context, a particular grunt might actually be worth quite a lot. I'm thinking of Arnold Schwarzenegger, our former governor. But anyway, but the point, I actually did find some cases where people made $1 million a grunt. Okay, so the thing is, it's very contextual. You can't, if you're going to believe in market dynamics, you can't assume the price in advance. You have to let the dynamic determine it. So what I'm thinking is that in there should be a sort of a curved space effect. The underlying metric should be based on there would probably be a scarcity of data that improves a corpora after a certain point, and the price per datum should start to go up then instead of down. And I believe that in the overall system I'm proposing that would happen. So I think what would start to happen is there might be windfalls for people who can grunt just right or provide that one little example that gets used. Now, there's a lot of subtlety in what I'm talking about that might not be apparent at first. So for instance, I'm proposing that whenever a cloud algorithm is functioning, it has to estimate the value of contributions of each person's work in a particular corpora it uses. And that might sound like a big job. However, what we're doing now is crazy. I mean, like, if you look at this world where there are these thousands of companies trying to step on each other to be the intermediaries for marketing data, to just send you some ad for a stupid cafe, and the whole economy is around who can block who, and where Google has to pay blackmail money to ad block to get its ads through. It's all this. It's like what we're doing right now is massively complex and nutty. And I think compared to what we're building, I think the thing I'm proposing actually could be simpler, but it's not simple. It's rather complex, and there are a lot of really interesting algorithmic subtleties about when you can compute values and when you can't, and how you deal with that. And also, I don't want to.
Even supposing you could,
yeah.
what I'm more curious about is what will compensate the children of 2050 for. I mean,
Right.
right now the data are extremely valuable, let's suppose we could do the attribution problem and compensate people by your model.
What,
Run
yeah,
this out 50 years and
I
now there's
guess
a new person.
here's the way I'd put it. Let's say it's 50 years from now, okay? And people have a choice. They can become complacent with some technology base, and they say, our cars drive themselves, our products are printed, we have no wants, there's no need for innovation. That to me is a sort of a static and unhappy end to the process of civilization and technological improvement. What I'd rather those people are saying, wow, there must be some room for innovation here. I'm going to come up with something new that makes it even better. I'm going to, something else is going to happen. And so what I hope is that this creates an incentive for that. But I want to be very careful here because I don't want to pretend that I have some utopian complete solution here. However, I do believe that this tendency, actually, if I remember you have a question, but I want to go back to your, maybe another way to approach this question is, let me answer another question that I often hear, and which is similar, but it's in the present, and that is people will say, what about the problem that most people wouldn't provide anything of value, right? Um, what about the problem that most people aren't creative, and that's a really interesting comment. And what I always say to those people is, you might be right, but you might not be. So let's keep an open mind about the distribution of value in an information economy because we don't know. And there's some evidence that ordinary people are already providing data that's valued by markets as being remarkably valuable, even though they don't see that value themselves.
And you're hopeful that that match can be maintained
Yeah,
over
but
decades.
but let me just say two things about present value. The first thing is one of the projects I'm trying to formulate now, and it's hard. I would be doing it already if I had all the answers about how to create an experimental methodology that we really think is robust and can defend. But right now, there are a lot of techniques one could use to measure how much data from somebody is worth. One way is to look at what third-party intermediates value the data at, and so there are all this whole world of marketing people that are, like I say, stepping on each other's toes and blackmailing each other to try to get between your data and somebody who's willing to pay for it. It's a crazy, insane scene. But there are other measurements. For instance, when you pay less because you sign up for somebody's frequent buyer program, you use a card when you shop for groceries or when you get a plane ticket, you're entering into their information system and they view that as valuable. And a portion of that is the value of your information. Now, a portion of it is locking you into something, so they're paying you to reduce your mobility. But those two things are somewhat fungible, I'd argue, in the big picture. At any rate, there's a method that you can start to calculate, and in just some early rough cut estimates. So I've tried to come up with this imaginary person who I call the most boring person in the world. He's the opposite of that guy in the beer commercials who's the most interesting man in the world. He's the most boring person in the world. And whenever I'm at Stanford, when I'm at Berkeley, I say it's a Stanford student. So here I'll say it's a Berkeley student, and it's a, and this is the person whose data means the least to anyone. That person, just based on the sort of market standards that have come up for valuing people's information, is probably already generating bits worth a few $100s a year now. And it appears to be going up. And a very interesting thing is does it plateau out at some level, and what is that level? And the really interesting question to me is, might it intersect the poverty line? Because if that level intersects the poverty line, then we have a whole new way to think about creating a society that's not redistributive, that's not socialist. But anyway, the thing I want to point out is that every time there's a new wave of what we might call automation or hyper-efficiency through digital systems, there's a new value placed on the information from people. So each one of those also values that information as being higher and higher. Now, another thing I want to point out is that some people say, well, if you start paying people, aren't you just taking money away from entrepreneurs or something? And the thing that really bugs me about this is that people who believe in market economies will freely move back and forth between biases towards zero-sum or non-zero-sum thinking without noticing that they're making that transition. So if you believe in non-zero-sum benefits from market economies, which I think is a very well-justified belief based on the history of such economies, then no, the point of this is you're creating economic growth. And then there's another way to put this that's even more concrete, which is Right now, by not valuing corpora data in an economy that's being increasingly driven by cloud algorithms, what you're saying is you're throwing a bunch of the value of the economy off the books. You're saying we won't have an accounting for this value. So the more advanced our technology gets, the more the value that goes into that is not accounted for in our economy. So therefore, we see a slowing of economic growth when we're actually getting better technology, which should be reflected in a growing economy. So in a way, the easiest way to put this is to say, let's make our accounting more complete. Right? And so in a sense, that's all I'm saying. So it's absolutely true. And another way to address your concern is, if the world starts to really be run automatically by some machine, like in many science fiction tales, and people don't have to do anything, yeah, there'd be a problem. A lot of them wouldn't get paid. And that's the future where you have your socialist revolution, I guess. However, if we enter into a world where people are still striving, still looking for value, still looking for difference, still creative, then I don't think we enter into that scenario. I think you were next, so I'll do you, then you, and then you.
I'll take my stuff later.
So how does the fact
I
that,
yield to Don.
how does the fact that the government, i.e. the NSA and the Homeland Security forces, have a copy of it all enter into the equation?
Yeah, so the first thing to say, I'm sure many people in this room have had some contact with the NSA because they have a very nice math institute where many of our friends work. And every contact I've had with that world has made me feel the same as I feel about Silicon Valley, that it's very youthful and very sweet. And my tendency is to like them and trust them. But of course, we have to be concerned about who could inherit their powers. I say a very similar thing about science fiction. I think we're blessed with an unusually good-natured elite in Silicon Valley, but who will inherit it? Facebook is a giant public corporation controlled by one person, which is a really weird thing in itself. But that means there's a position for somebody to inherit, and when there is such a thing, the people who are successful in inheriting it are often not great. So one worries about the setup here. Anyway, in my view, the NSA has made a mistake. And their mistake is exactly the mirror of what Silicon Valley did and what the financiers did, which is they see the value in cloud algorithms. And because they, by definition, will tend to work a lot at first, they are mistakenly thinking that they have this automatic security nozzle that they can turn on and calculate security. And the science is bad behind that. It doesn't really work that way. And so I think there's this something for nothing automatic benefit kind of thinking that overtakes a lot of people, because initially it is like that when you have big computing. It just doesn't last. And so I'm concerned that they're fooling themselves in that particular way. I think there are a lot of very fine, smart people there. Unfortunately, the mathematicians do not run it. They only work for the people who run it. And so I would rather see the NSA run by the mathematicians, who I think are smarter than the people who are paying their salaries in that case, but such is often the case. Yes?
The fact that all kind of stupid systems are in place for rewarding people isn't new. I mean, homemakers haven't gotten credit for example, for a long time. And so I just wonder, it seems to me, and Ted Nelson has been advocating micropayments, as I recall. So how do you transition to a logical system? How do you get people to say, okay, we're not going to change on January 1. How are you going to get there from here?
Yeah. So first, I use the example of homemakers in the book as one example, as a metaphor. So I think it's exactly right. You've absolutely asked me the hardest question I'd expect. That's what I would expect you to do. And
it's easy to write a book.
I did not say it was easy. No, I was saying it in the spirit of, I can't believe what I did to myself. It was not easy at all. It was torture. I can't even, I have a friend who's a wonderful physicist. He just sold his first book. And he's like, oh, did I get the right advance? Do I have the right agent? Is my editor good? Do you like my proposal? I say, don't worry about those things. You're going to find out what to worry about very soon when you have to write the damn thing. It's like, you don't even, Anyway, so to answer your question on the transition issue, that's by far the hardest question in this whole sort of way of thinking. I go into some ideas, admittedly somewhat vaguely in the book, because I view this as a very early phase in thinking about this stuff. One of the ideas I propose is what I call economic avatars, which is a way of using using networking to give people a psychological way of understanding their role in the economy that matches what they're used to, that can be interpreted in different ways. Now, one of the things to say about economics is that market economies have always depended on what you could call costumery and gimmickry and fictions and whatnot. For instance, when there's a sale, you say, "Oh, I got a bargain." Well, not really. You just paid the price that was working in the market at that point. Like there's no such thing as a sale. I mean, it just doesn't. It's a psychological ploy. And don't even get me started about Groupon. Oh my God! But anyway, so we lie to ourselves. And another neighbor on the other side in Berkeley is Danny Kahneman, who's one of the pioneers of bringing psychology into economics and recognizing that if you assume that all the actors in an economy are rational, you will not model that economy accurately because people are not necessarily rational. And so what I'm proposing is, in a sense, extending what has been necessary for people who are retailers or really any kind of service provider or goods seller in the past, and to create fictions, but ones that are viable. And so, for instance, I talk about a scenario where somebody thinks of themselves as still living in one regime where they're not getting paid for their information, they get stuff for free. But I believe that over time, eventually, the balance would work out in their favor if they switched, and they would get this little notice saying, "Hey, you've been doing this for a while. If you want to start thinking in the new way, you're owed some money, but it's up to you." The other thing I feel very firmly about this is that a transition has to have many more winners than losers. It has to be win-win as much as possible. And I want to be clear that I'm not a socialist, or I'm very fond of my friends who've done well in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley has treated me extremely well. Just for what it's worth, if anybody's counting, I've sold companies that are parts of Adobe, Google, Oracle, and Pfizer. So I'm a serial startup entrepreneur as well as the other stuff. I love success. I have no objection to it. And I love the idea of a distribution of outcomes where the society makes room for high performance people. All of that makes total sense to me. What I do think is that the society needs to have something like a normal distribution of outcomes in order to be sustainable. It doesn't have to be perfectly that. But if you don't have a big hump in the middle, you can't have your politics remain uncorrupted. You can't have customers for your market economy. And I can go over the other theories about what makes a society work, but all of them are ruined if the distribution deviates too much from normal. And so what I think is if you... you know what? I just talked myself into forgetting my thread, so my apologies for that. But anyway, the economic avatar is one potential answer. I have some other ideas as well that I propose in the book.
This idea, like you said before, of the having your Safeway card or something, where everybody thinks they're getting a reward instead of a salary. Is a transition mechanism.
It could very well be. I mean, the problem with we have this sort of fake barter economy now where people say, "Oh, I'm getting benefits that aren't money. I'm getting lower cost rides because of Uber. I'm getting lower cost education because of MOOCs. I'm getting lower cost whatever because of Groupon. I'm getting lower cost groceries because of my Safeway card." And the problem with all those things is that it always puts you in a diminished role in the market. You're never a first-class citizen. You're always accepting the deal given. You never have mobility or an ability to negotiate. So what it does is it ruins the symmetry that's needed to have a market economy, and that's precisely, so that results in turn in extreme wealth concentration and an income inequality. That's another thing I didn't get into, but one of the things that's really bugged me is we've been more part of the problem than part of the solution in preserving the middle classes in developed societies.
Three more minutes before the video stops. So.
But then you can do the really cool stuff.
Yes.
There should be a reward for being live. So save
Oh,
this
so this is
stuff.
the video part, yeah.
Yeah.
And I feel like I have to, so if I only have a few more minutes, let me just say, I feel like I've only barely scratched the surface on this body of thought. And the book was written quite quickly, and it also is only barely a scratch. But research is continuing. I won't embarrass him now, but a graduate student from the department worked with me as an intern over the summer on building some models of some aspects of it. So we're trying to make things more formal and more robust. And it's a process. And I should also say something about my expectation for time frame. I think the time to figure this out is between now and a couple decades from now. I don't think this has to be fixed tomorrow. I think this has to be fixed before the massive waves of unemployment would come about from improved technology. So we have a little bit of wiggle room, but now's a good time to start sorting it out. I also don't think that the ideas I've been talking about are necessarily the only way to approach it. There's some others that have some similarities and some differences that could also be talked about. I'm not ideological or adamant that I know the right way or anything like that. I am adamant that the existing ways that everybody talks about, like when somebody says, oh, we're improving the future of our economy with social networking or something, I don't think that works. I think that just concentrates money with whoever has the biggest computer. This is actually the final point I'll make. One of the ideologies that drove me tremendously in the decades of anticipation before all this stuff started to work was that if information was open, it would be this great equalizer where all kinds of people would be empowered. And the thing that I realized too late is that if everybody has access to information openly, it does not create equal opportunity because some people have more effective computers than other people. So the truth is that you could go scrape the internet just like Google. I mean, it's just out there. Just scrape the web, you know. But you don't have a city-sized server farm to process it. And so you could also calculate your way to a seemingly perfect market position, but you don't have the big computation and the hookup to do high-frequency trading. You know, so there's a huge differential in how powerful and how effective computers are based on their positioning, based on their size, based on the people who work with them, based on various things. But that differential is gigantic. It used to be that if you look at who the richest people are in societies around the world, they tended to be closer to either political power, an oil field, or some kind of narrows of trade or something like that. But increasingly around the world, at the United Nations, I saw this. When you meet rich people, and you ask them, "Well, what's your gig? You know, why are you this billionaire?" They're always close to some big computer. Increasingly, they're like, "Oh, I run the trading system here, or I'm running the cell network here, or I'm running the giant data exchange or the social networking in this giant emerging economy or something like that." It's everybody's always close to some computational thing. So that's obviously not a sustainable way to run a civilization.
I think with that,
Yeah.
thank you and applaud.
Sure, and I will get your questions. Quickly and cheaply was just an astonishing idea. It was something so novel, so remarkable, and so profound that, of course, we still just marvel at it all the time. And a lot of our culture seems to be sort of self-congratulatory at this point about the fact that the thing actually works. But a part of that, for me, was a sort of imagining the good that would come of it. And that good would take place on various levels. For instance, my friends and I at the time, my comrades in this quest, believed that this would create tremendous economic opportunity, that all kinds of people would find ways to improve themselves, improve their lives when they had more open access to information. We also thought that it would serve as a kind of an inoculation against extreme power concentration. If you look at the history of how people treat each other badly, the recurring pattern is that somebody gets powerful and treats masses of people terribly, and the first thing they try to do is control communication. They try to control whatever the channels of communication are in the era in which they're being a creep, whether that's a TV station or the printing press or whatever. And so the notion was, well, if you have an open information system, it ought to make that pattern become more diffuse. So we're quite certain we're doing good things for the world. I was part of the generation that invented some of the rhetoric that's really become standard at this point. Last night I got in from New York City. I spoke at the United Nations General Assembly about this stuff this week, and it's remarkable to me to hear heads of state from around the world, the new cliches that they just parrot about technology and the future and the internet and openness are the stuff we made up in cafes in Palo Alto 30 years ago. You know, a bunch of ne'er-do-well, hippie, freaky, geeky kids, and now this stuff is just the standard rhetoric. Um, and I found it's basically they exist, they're real, and I think today, if you're willing to really relax your standards, we might be getting up into the low hundreds on a global basis, and in the U.S. maybe 50-ish. So it's ramping up, but we're not seeing thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. We're seeing a very small phenomenon. And they're tenuous. What's interesting is the ones that I found a few years ago, of those, only one is still maintaining a career today. And so the thing is that this sense that there's this counter force of people who are creating a living in a new way is actually a fiction. It's a very popular fiction. It's kind of like the Satanists who steal babies or something. Like, it's this thing a lot of people believe is out there, but they are not actually out there. There are people who pretend to be them, and it took a little bit of work to try to figure out what was real and what wasn't. But there are people who pay to create the illusion that they're making a living this way because it's fashionable. And then, in order to figure out who's authentic and who's not, sometimes you can just ask them, and sometimes it takes a bit more work. But in terms of clear-cut examples, they're very, very, very rare. What is not rare at all is somebody who's extremely well established in the traditional system doing something like a giveaway on the internet for publicity. So if you're Radiohead or something like that, that works great. And there's a lot of examples of that. I don't think that should count. That's a publicity thing, and they still count on the traditional system for their money. Anyway, so just in terms of musicians, I found myself disappointed in the economic results. So then I wanted to look at, well, you know what, if it's just musicians and journalists and photographers, if it's certain specific classes, which are the people who are sort of dealing with information anyway, if it's the communicators, if it's those people, that's okay, because we can create institutions to support them. We can create new institutions to support investigative journalists. We can compensate. Society can figure that out. That's an accept. I found myself in a bit of a personal crisis around the turn of the century, the same time that this student was surprised I still existed, because I felt that much of what I anticipated was not playing out as anticipated. I'll give you a couple of examples. One of them is that I'd been very much part of the early movement to encourage file copying and open sharing of information, and being suspicious of copyright law. And I'm also a musician, a professional musician, and I was certain that if we allowed music to flow freely and through file copying, that what that would result in is more opportunity. That clinging to this old business model was silly and short-sighted. So I helped make up a lot of the rhetoric that still is extremely commonplace and is held dearly by many people. But what I started to see around the turn of the century is that actually musicians were doing worse and worse. Now, of course, there's still some who do very well at the very tippy top of a power law curve. But what I was seeing is that what had been a middle hump, what had been approximately a standard distribution of outcomes, was turning into a hollowed out distribution with, or what we call a long tail. A lot of wannabes and only a few people who succeeded. And this hit me pretty hard in a special way, which is that there were quite a large number, I'd say a whole generation of musicians who had been enormously successful and revered, and well, not enormously successful, but they weren't like superstars, they weren't Michael Jacksons, but they were people who had gotten into the upper middle class at the very least, and were famous and were cherished, but in later in life they hadn't been able to hold on to health insurance in the US, they'd lost their homes, So there's an anecdote I sometimes tell for a laugh when I'm just speaking somewhere randomly, but it took place here, so I'll tell it again here. Right around the turn of the millennium, I turned 40. I was born in 1960, and I was lecturing in this building, and a freshman walked in the room and looked at me and said, "Jaron Lanier, you're still alive?" I was like, "Oh God." Computer science is a little rough on you, because it just moves so fast. And so anyway, yep, still going here, 53. Um, so I wrote a book last year, very rapidly. Most people take off time to write a book. I somehow did it working overnights and on weekends while I was running other research projects, but it somehow got done. It's called Who Owns the Future, and it's about the relationship between technology and employment, technology and human roles, and particularly computational technology. Uh, so I'm going to share with you a summary view of it. The full picture is a little bit too complex to get into one talk, but I think I can summarize it. Uh, so let me start by recalling the excitement that I'm sure some of the people in this room will recall very vividly, but if you're younger, you won't have been born yet. Um, but the excitement that arose around anticipation of networking before it actually worked, before it existed. So going back, I was a teenager in the 70s, and that's when I really started interacting with people about it. And this notion that someday there would be a way that information could just move around between people. And it was getting to the point where every week I was being asked to get involved in some emergency fundraiser at a jazz club or something. And I started to realize this isn't just a few exceptions, this is the pattern. And so what I started to do was try to gather real data on what was actually happening to the people that I thought we were helping. And I found something that was really kind of extraordinary to me. One thing is that the number of people who were making a good living in the era of copyright was actually larger than I had realized. In the United States, there were almost 1/3 of a million musicians making over $100,000 a year, which it's not as good as it's not like selling Instagram to Facebook or something, but it's a very nice living. You can live well on that, certainly. Um, we might forget that in Silicon Valley, but that's considered success in most of the world. And uh, and that number had been driven down by 2/3 within just about 5 years. There's a total collapse, and it seems to be headed to much less than that. It's continuing to drop. And meanwhile, there's this mythology that there are all these musicians who are coming up and um, doing great by creating unconventional careers using network technology, where they promote themselves, they get fans to show up, and there's people just assume there must be a replacement force that's coming in. So what I thought is, well, if the new wave is not being captured by the old measurements, which wouldn't be surprising, let's try to measure the new wave and see what's really going on. And so I started to try to count individual musicians who were being successful. And I did everything I could think of to do it. I went to every kind of business that might cater to them. And I know musicians. I mean, I tried, and I went on the popular sites that support this point of view, like the Boing Boings and whatnot. And I called out, if you have any stories of somebody doing this, send them to me. I tried to find them. And when I wrote my previous book, which was published a few years ago, the number I came up with was about 5 individuals. I mean,